All right, welcome to today's explainer. We are officially opening up the ultimate cold case. If you really think about it, the study of evolution is basically the greatest, most complex, ongoing detective investigation in human history. We're trying to piece together a story that kicked off billions of years ago, and we're doing it using scattered clues, ancient DNA, and forensic science to figure out exactly how life on Earth went from simple microscopic dots to the absolutely staggering web of biodiversity that's all around us today. It's a phenomenal mystery, and we're going to dive right in and solve it together by unpacking the key evidence, chapter by chapter.
Okay, here is our case file index for today. We'll start with section 1, the origin of life. Then we'll look at clues from the past, followed by adapting to survive. Next up, Darwin and natural selection, and we'll wrap things up with the math of evolution.
Section 1, the origin of life.
To really get our heads around how life changed over millions of years, we first have to understand the sheer scale of the universe itself. There's this fantastic perspective from our source material. The universe is so unimaginably vast that stellar distances have to be measured in light years. So when you look up at the stars on a clear night, the light hitting your eyes actually started its journey millions of years ago. You are, quite literally, looking into a time machine. Now, compared to the entire universe, Earth is just a tiny speck of dust. But hey, it's the speck where our entire story unfolds. So the early investigators of this cold case naturally asked, did life actually come from outer space? It's a wild thought, right? Early Greek thinkers certainly thought so. They believed units of life called spores were bouncing around and transferring to different planets, which is an idea known as panspermia. Honestly, for a long time, people even believed life just spontaneously generated from decaying matter, like rotting straw or mud. But careful experiments by Louis Pasteur completely debunked that, proving that life only comes from pre-existing life. So how did the very first life start? Well, scientists O'Perrin and Haldane propose that life was preceded by chemical evolution. Basically, inorganic constituents eventually combined and cooked up diverse organic molecules. Let's map out a timeline just to grasp the massive, mind-boggling scale we're dealing with here. The Earth formed about 4 billion years ago, and back then it was hostile. We're talking crazy high temperatures, volcanic storms, and a totally different, reducing atmosphere. Fast forward a whole billion years, about 3 billion years ago, and we finally see the very first non-cellular forms of life. Think giant molecules like RNA and proteins. And it actually wasn't until 2,000 million years ago that the first single-celled life forms finally appeared. And they did all of this entirely underwater. And a brilliant experiment by an American scientist named S.L. Miller in 1953 perfectly illustrates exactly how that chemical evolution could have gone down. He essentially built a time machine in a lab. He trapped early Earth conditions inside a closed flask. Water vapor, methane, hydrogen, and ammonia, all superheated to 800 degrees Celsius, and then he zapped it with an electric discharge to simulate ancient lightning storms. The result? He actually observed the formation of amino acids. This proved right there on the lab that the biological building blocks of life absolutely could form from non-living chemistry.
Section 2, clues from the past.
Okay, so life got started. But how do we actually prove it evolved? Well, any good detective knows you have to look at the physical evidence left behind at the scene. Paleontology lets us compare the hard, fossilized parts of ancient life forms found deep in rocks to the organisms walking around today. When we compare an ancient fossilized skull directly with its modern counterpart, the anatomical similarities are just striking. These fossils are like historical snapshots. They prove beyond a doubt that entirely different forms of life existed at different geological times, and that modern forms slowly, gradually arose from them. Beyond the fossils, comparative anatomy gives us two massive clues to work with: homologous and analogous structures. Now, homologous structures point to divergent evolution, meaning different animals sharing a common ancestor. Think of a human arm, a cheetah's leg, a bat's wing, and a whale's flipper. They all do completely different jobs, but structurally, they share the exact same pattern of bones. It's wild. Analogous structures are the exact opposite. They are the result of convergent evolution. This happens when entirely different ancestors develop similar features simply because they're trying to survive in similar habitats. A perfect example? The wings of a butterfly and the wings of a bird. Completely different blueprints, exact same function.
Section 3, adapting to survive.
As those ancient life forms multiplied, things got crowded and they had to spread out. Which brings us to a really cool concept called adaptive radiation. Imagine a single ancestral species finding itself in a brand new, uncharted environment. As populations of that original species spread out into different niches, maybe some move up into the trees, some stay on the ground, some start eating insects, others crack open seeds, they physically adapt to those highly specific habitats. So from one single starting point, multiple different species literally radiate outwards. The absolute best evidence we have for adaptive radiation in action comes from isolated geographies. Take the Galapagos Islands. Darwin famously found a whole variety of finches there. They all clearly evolved from one original seed-eating ancestor, but over time, their beaks had radically changed shape to tackle different diets, from tiny insects to tough cactus. And we see the exact same thing in Australia, an entire continent full of incredibly diverse marsupials, all evolved from a single ancestral stock, totally isolated from the rest of the planet.
Section 4. Darwin and Natural Selection. So this perfectly cues up the star witness of our entire investigation, Charles Darwin. Darwin observed that populations inherently possess variations, and because resources in nature are always limited, there is constant competition just to survive. Natural selection means that nature essentially selects the individuals whose heritable variations make them the absolute best fit for their specific environment. And here is a crucial takeaway. In biology, fitness isn't about being the biggest or the strongest. It refers ultimately and only to reproductive fitness. The best adapted survive to leave behind more offspring. It's that simple.
But hey, Darwin wasn't the only detective working this case, and scientific understanding definitely evolved over time. Before Darwin, the French naturalist Lamarck argued that evolution was driven by the use and disuse of organs. He thought, for example, a giraffe stretched its neck to reach high leaves and then just passed that newly stretched neck on to its babies. Darwin corrected this, bringing the focus squarely onto competition and natural selection. And then later on, in the 20th century, Hugo de Vries added another massive piece to the puzzle. Based on his work with evening primroses, he argued that sudden, large mutations are actually what trigger the sudden variations that Darwin had observed.
Section 5. The Math of Evolution. All right, we have the motive and we have the mechanism. Now let's look at the forensic math. And please don't let the algebra scare you off. The Hardy-Weinberg principle is basically just a baseline detector for genetic equilibrium. It states that in a perfectly stable population, the frequency of alleles, which are just the variations of genes, will remain totally constant from generation to generation, always adding up to exactly 1. When we measure a real-world population and the numbers differ from this expected baseline, it means the genetic equilibrium is disturbed. And that mathematical disturbance, that is literal, hard proof that evolution is actively occurring. Let's break down exactly what can disrupt that perfect mathematical balance. There are 5 specific factors that can throw the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium off and cause evolution. Number 1, gene migration, or gene flow, where a population moves and mixes its genes with another. 2, genetic drift, which is an evolutionary change driven purely by random chance. 3, mutations, which create entirely new traits out of nowhere. 4, genetic recombination during reproduction. And number 5, natural selection, where nature actively favors the most advantageous traits. When absolutely any of these 5 things happen, the math changes and the species evolves. The story of evolution is incredible, but honestly, the most mind-blowing thing to remember is that this case is still completely open. We are a living, breathing part of this branching descent. The source text makes a fascinating point. The evolution of modern humans appears to closely parallel the evolution of our brains and our complex language. And as our habitats continue to change, especially with rapid technology and modern environments, we are still absolutely subjected to those mathematical rules of genetic drift and natural selection. So, what new forms will life take next? Well, that is a mystery nature is solving right now. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and stay curious.